All the researchers say that if you got it, you're more immune from somebody who was vaccinated.
Yeah.
Yeah, which Gemara are we looking at?
Oh, see?
Wow. That's very
See you? There, which Gemara are we looking at?
Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
Sanhedrin, story of David and Batsheva.
Yeah, but which
Tracate Sanhedrin, page 107. It's a big page.
107A?
Can you share this?
In the on the art scroll, it's 107.
I'm an olive from a bit.
All over the place.
Yeah.
Sort of the top of the page.
No, I'm just trying my second.
Literally the very top of the page. Very, very top of the page.
He's a Persian.
It's not knowing.
The Persian too? Not really. Nobody's perfect.
I think it's.
Really? 25%. I guess back in the day, yeah.
All right.
Still, nice video. Good. How are you doing?
All right, so let's jump into it. We're going to discuss today a Talmudic story and episode, which is from the more famous stories
Good crowd.
from the more famous stories in Judaism. It's a story which many are familiar with. It's been turned into a classic song, non-Jewish song, right? The story of David and Batsheva, David and Batsheva. The Hallelujah, isn't it?
That's really.
Got it, yeah.
Is it 107?
107A. Who was it? Leonard Cohen. Hello, Shalom. Yeah. Barry Mitchell, welcome.
Oh, speaking of Montreal, Leonard Cohen.
Like he was Montreal?
Isn't there a big mural of Leonard Cohen in Montreal?
Yeah, the whole building was
All right. So the Talmud today, we're going to talk about the story. And the reason we're going to talk about the story is because we are in the month of Elul. So I brought out some Talmuds and some Tehillims. The Tehillims are because we're going to quote verses from Tehillim. The Talmud, I only have a couple, so you have to follow along. So keep an eye on both books. And so you'll see, we go from, it's random verses which we read, and it interprets the verses. So if you want, you could follow along in those or the Gemara. Either way, even if you don't have any books, you'll be able to follow along in this story, classic story. Okay,
As long as your snare stands still.
we're going to try. Do our best to stand in one place. So the Gemara starts by saying over here, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav. And here's a very important lesson, which the whole story the Talmud talks about David and Batsheva is to teach us a lesson, and that is, La'olam al yavi adam atzmo lidei nisayim. A person should not bring oneself to be tested. So in life, we face tests. And often we have this idea that the tests we face make us stronger. But don't put yourself in a situation of being tested. It's very different between saying God is testing me and therefore I'm being stronger versus I'm going to I'm going to put myself in a circumstance where I know I'm going to be tested because I believe in my inner strength. Don't bring yourself to a situation of test. If you know that there's a certain place which maybe brings out the worst of you, or a certain group of people which brings out the worst of you, or certain situations which test your fortitude, whether it's ethical, moral, spiritual, it tests you. Don't put yourself in that situation. If you're tested on your own, great. In other words, if it happens, then embrace the test and try to find, maybe it's a challenge, embrace it as a challenge. But there's a difference between challenging yourself versus bringing yourself to a nisayon, to a test. I think challenging yourself is fine. Challenging yourself means, using physical example as opposed to spiritual example. I challenge myself to see, can I run 10 miles today instead of 9 miles? Okay, that's a challenge. But bringing yourself to be tested, specifically morally or ethically, is something else. That's saying putting yourself in a situation which you know could bring out the worst of you. And that's different. That you should not do. Where do we know that? What's the source of that in the Torah? The source of that is this is a story of King David. How so? Shaharei, because, says the Talmud again, 107a, Sanhedrin, David Melech Yisrael, David, the king of Israel. This is David's not just a king. He's one of the most righteous people in history. You know, here's a little Jewish trivia. and that is, and you would probably know the answer because of the context, and that is if which name is mentioned in the Torah and the Bible more than any other name. So most people, when asked that question, assume it's Moses. So Moses. The answer, and it's not even close, is David. King David is mentioned in the Torah. Someone told me 770 times. 770. That's what I was told, but I haven't done the count. But King David is mentioned in the Torah more so than any other person. Holy King David, and yet when he put himself in a situation of being tested, he couldn't pass the test. Why? What is the story? Amar Lafanov, it says, King David asked the following of God. He said, Ribono Shalom, God in heaven. Mipnei ma omrim, why is it that when Jews pray, which we do until today, this following, we say Elokei Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. The Jews pray, they say, God of Abraham, God of Yitzchak, God of Jacob, Yaakov. V'le'ein omrim Elokei David. Why don't they mention the God of David? You know, I'm the primary king of the Jewish people. Shouldn't we be saying Elokei David? Now we do say David in other situations. We say, like at the end of the Haftorahs, we say Magen David, the shield of David. But in the Shemona Esrei, in the Amidah, the highlighted prayer, we say, blessed are you, God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob.
You also mentioned David once.
Where?
David of the
Right. The right.
But it's not as
It's not the same as the first blessing. Very good. Right.
No, he goes to work.
So that was King David's question. Why don't you mention David? So what was the answer? Omar. So God answers. Anybody want to venture to guess? Why is it that we mention Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and not David? Unless you looked ahead. But if you didn't, anyone want to guess? What was God's response?
The three first blessings are equivalent to the three fathers. Magen Avraham is for Abraham. Mechayem Etim is because Yitzchak was about to be slaughtered, actually was
Right.
going to the Shamayim, and Yaakov is holy, so that's Kadosh.
But why not? Why? Firstly, he was talking about the very first blessing. We say all three. You say Baruch Atah Hashem, right when we start Shemona Esrei, Elokeinu Elokei Avosinu, the God of our fathers, Elokei Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. Why not David? So you're answering that you have the three, but why not? Why shouldn't there be a fourth connected to David? David is also a very important person in our history.
Why not? Okay, Sarah. Okay.
Okay, this is a good question too.
This is the shit.
That I'm gonna have to get to some other time.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
So what is the reason? I just went 2 weeks ago. I was in Israel. I was at the cave of the patriarchs and matriarchs, and I was there. Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, and Leah. And then separately, I went to Cave Rachel, the burial place of Rachel. One of the things you get when you go to Israel, which you don't get anywhere else, is that this was the only place where you go into a taxi, you can get a Dvar Torah. That's what happened. I went into a taxi in Jerusalem, and the whole ride, he was telling us Dvar Torah. So one of the Dvar Torahs he said is, why is it that Rachel is buried separately from the others? You have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. You have Sarah, Rivka, and Leah, and then Rachel is buried separately. So there's a biblical story, which is that she passed away suddenly, so he buried her separately. He's like, okay, but what's another answer? What are the answers? So he gave two answers, one which I liked. He said, one answer is because Rachel, the mother Rachel, is so important that it should never be seen that you visited her as a like afterthought. In other words, when you have 6 people buried in one place, so you could say any one of them, I was going for the other, and while I was there, I happened to also say a prayer for Abraham. I was going to really send regards to Sarah. Abraham's there, Yitzchak is there, Yaakov is there. Okay, so while I'm there, I'm also going to pray, on their behalf as well. He says with Rachel, whenever you go there, she is the sole attention. You're not going for any other reason other than to visit her, as opposed to the other ones, because there's 6 of them buried in one place. So each one you could say, this is not the main reason I'm going. This is a side. He said that's the reason Rachel is very sensitive. She's so important that she should never be a secondary reason for a visit. That was an interesting answer he gave. But anyway, this is David Mel's question. Why is it that we daven, we say the Father, we bless the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Abraham? And God answers. What's the answer that God gave? Amar, he said, Inhu minsuli. They were tested. Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were tested, and they passed their tests. Ba'at lo min sikli. You have not been tested. He says, you may be great, maybe the king of the Jewish people, maybe the greatest king they've ever had, but Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were tested. Abraham was tested, we know, many times, 10 tests. Yitzchak was tested in the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, was a test for Isaac. Yaakov was tested in numerous ways. His son was lost for 22 years. His father-in-law tried to kill him. I mean, there's so many tests. And David was not tested. Which is interesting because if you look at the history of David, he seems to have been tested as well, right? That's a great point. He says, you were not tested.
And even from a very young age comparing to that.
Let's see if there's any of the commentaries over here to discuss that. So the way it's explained over here, that you were not tested to the degree that they were tested. Because over here, footnote number 5, he says, the patriarchs earned the privilege of having my name affixed to theirs because they withstood all the tests of faith to which they were subjected. Abraham was subjected to 10 tests. Yitzchak was ready to be slaughtered as an offering to God. Yaakov endured a life of suffering, yet he persevered in his faith. You, David, on the other hand, have never been subjected to a test of faith as severe as those to which the forefathers were. So it's not everyone. He said, obviously he was tested. We're all tested, but he said you can't compare what you were tested by to what the forefathers were.
What about shell track?
Okay, so that, well, you could say that it wasn't necessarily a divine test. That was almost like that was the price of doing business when you're in the ruling class. Somebody wants to kill you, you have to defend yourself. That was more of a test of life, and he survived. I don't know. That's just off the top of my head. I'm suggesting. So what does David Melch say? He says, okay. Omar Lapana. So he says to that. So God says, okay, if that's the case, the Chaneni even Aseni. So the testament. He says, all right, challenge accepted. You say that the forefathers were tested in a way that I wasn't. I'd like you to test me. And remember, the start of this whole Talmud was don't pursue tests. A person should not ask to be tested. So David HaMelech said to God, test me. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, and here's where you see we're going to go to Tehillim. If you have a Tehillim in front of you, you could open up chapter 26, verse number 2. What does the pasuk over there say? Chapter 26, verse number 2. B'chaneni Hashem v'naseni sarfa kol yosai v'libi. How does it translate it over there, Elior?
Examine me, Hashem, and test me.
Test me. Now, when you read it to me, a whole understanding of that pasuk, he says to God, test me. Not I have passed your test, so why do I have to deal with bad things? No, why do bad things happen to me? He says the opposite. Test me. Put me up to the challenge. Okay. Omar. So now we have God's response. Omar. There's mincing enough. Okay, I'll test you. But furthermore, but I'm going to do something for you in this test that I'm going to give you. I'm going to do something. I'm going to do something that to the forefathers I didn't do. Because I'm going to test you like I tested them. But I'm going to do something for you that I didn't do for them. What's that? The others I never told what the test is going to be. Abraham and Yaakov were tested, and I didn't tell them what that test was going to be. But to you, I'm going to notify you. Not only am I going to test you, it's almost like, someone says, not only am I going to beat you, but I'm going to show you exactly where I'm going to hit that home run, right? Now I'm going to tell you, I'm going to beat you. So God says, I'm going to test you, but I'm not going to make it a surprise. I'll let you know in advance what this test is going to be. What does he says? I am going to test you bidvar erva. He says, I'm going to test you in areas of morality. I'm going to test you to test your moral strength. There's all sorts of tests. There's tests of faith. Abraham was tested in matters of his love for his son Yitzchak, the faith of God. And Yitzchak was tested in that way. Yaakov was tested by loss of a child for a long time and by threat of death. God says to David, I'm giving you a heads up. Your test is going to be how strong you are morally. Let's remember, as we all know, when it comes to leadership, that's a test that leadership uniquely face. A leader, someone who is greatness, the test of sexual morality is something which is very unique for a leader as it is. And some pass, many don't. And here's what he says to David, that's where your test is going to be. All right. Next part of the Gemara is, shall we say, a little bit R-rated. If I can see here, it's working out. But it's not, this is where here's where the Gemara describes a little bit of David's behavior over here and how to respond to it. He says, Miyad, immediately, and now we have a pasuk. Here's where the story begins in the book of Shmuel. The famous story of David and Batsheva begins over here. So the pasuk says, the pasuk from Shmuel Beis, chapter 11, verse number 2. The pasuk is, "Vayihi le'eis ha'erev." It was in the evening time. Vayakom David me'al mishkavo. David stood up from his bed. Vayishalech el gag beis hamelech. And he went to the rooftop. Now, I'm not reading from the Gemara, I'm reading from a pasuk. And he went to the rooftop of the king. Vayar isha rochetzes, and he noticed a woman who was bathing, me'al hagag. She saw from the roof a woman who was bathing. Va'isha tovas mareh me'od, and the woman was very beautiful. Okay, so that's what the pasuk tells us. Now the Gemara gives us a little. This is the beginning of, again, this famous story. It's a story which is often misunderstood. Story of David and Batsheva. But now the Gemara gives us a little bit of backdrop of what's going on over here. The Gemara says, "Vayihi le'eis erev," and it was evening time. Vayakam David me'al mishkav, and David stands up from his bed. Why is it? It's already evening now. Usually, it's the morning when you get up from the bed. Why is David arising from his bed in the evening? That doesn't make sense. So the Medrash says, and the Gemara says something interesting. Amar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda said, "Shehapach mishkavo shel laila lemishkavo shel yom." He switched his nighttime bed for his daytime bed. What does that mean? What does that mean? What it means is, what's that? What it means is that David anticipated this test. David felt, and it's an interesting area of, you'll see, an interesting area of halacha. David anticipated this test, so he figured, how will I overcome sexual temptation? Is if I satisfy myself beforehand. Notice if I David was married, he was a married man, in fact, he had 18 wives. So he says, if I tend to my sexual needs beforehand, so then I will no longer have any need. And that's how I will overcome temptation. So that's what it means. It says that he switched his nighttime bed for his daytime bed. Now, there's something which the activity which he would typically do at night, he did during the day, earlier in the day, so that he wouldn't be tempted. That's what the Gemara is saying. That's what it means. That's the meaning of the pasuk, that at night he rose from his bed in the evening. In other words, he felt this was his way of overcoming any temptation. But that action was in itself a mistake. His thought process and his approach to this test, he was mistaken. Why? Says the Gemara. Nay, what does it say? David HaMelech forgot a halacha. David HaMelech forgot a halacha. What is the halacha? Again, it's a halacha. We say halacha over here really means more of a advice on how to behave. The halacha is like this. Gemara says, "Eiver katan yesh ba'adam." A person has a limb, referring over here to our sexual inclination. And what is the Talmud tell us? Masbi'oi ra'a umar ivoi saveya. It literally means that when a person satiates oneself, then one is hungry. And when a person hungers oneself, then they are satiated. Which means, obviously, the Talmud is using, so to say, refined language to teach a very important lesson, not only in sexuality, but in general in pursuits of life. And that is that when it comes to our desires, you may think, well, if I indulge myself, then I won't want anymore, right? If I indulge, then I won't want anymore. And the truth is the other way around. If you indulge, one remains hungry. And when one learns to control oneself, one hungers oneself, then one feels satisfied. And I think this is true, and I think we can now know this is true. That if a person pursues, when a person pursues any indulgence, whether it's sexual, whether it's an addiction to any area, whether it's food, the more that you think, well, if I eat, if I indulge, then I won't need it anymore. No, the more we indulge, the more you need. The more you indulge, the more you need. Yeah.
Okay, question for you all. Say like for the sexual desire, if someone say, I'm trying to keep. So say they're married and that blah blah. He has his 18 wives. So he's trying to reduce temptation. If King David had to do something that's really not the best in order to avoid temptation,
well, that's what the Gemara actually suggests.
But that's what. Okay, so even
if the Talmud is suggesting that he was trying to do just that. In other words, there's a certain idea, there's a certain thing brought into Jewish law that it's that intimacy between a man and a woman, and a husband and wife, in its most permitted state, should be at night. And so therefore, that was the way he did it. Over here, he did something which was considered to be inappropriate, but the goal was for a holy reason. He said, I'm trying to pass this test. But he made a mistake because the assumption that if you indulge, therefore you're not going to want it later, it's not the case. The more you have of something, the more you wanted it, right? When you have wealth, think about wealth. As soon as I achieve this amount of wealth, then I won't need money anymore. So I really don't want to be worried about money. So I'll really run after it for a little bit and then I'll be fine. No, as soon as you get your first million, as soon as you get your million, now I need another million. As soon as you get 10 million, you need 20. The more you pursue something, the more you're going to want it, not vice versa. So this is a very important halacha, not just about the story, important lesson in life.
How he didn't just satiate his desire at night,
No, because I guess maybe this was in the immediate aftermath of that conversation with God. He has this conversation and he sensed that test was looming. I guess, again, I'm assuming, that test was looming. He said, how do I ensure that I'm not even tempted? Oh, this was his assumption, mistake. I once remember hearing an example about when it comes to who really needs something more than another. So you have this, the analogy I was given is about a person at a meal. So you could have two people at a meal. One person is the host who's accustomed to the lavish dinner of meats and fish and all sorts of delicacies. And then you have the poor person who he invited to his home, who's now looking at a feast that he's never seen before. So now if you look at that scene, initially, you can assume that who is it that really craves the food? It's the poor person. I mean, look at him. Look at how his eyes are glazed over. He can't believe his luck, and he's taking from every dish. So that's how you would assume that it's the pauper who's invited. That's the person who really, as opposed to this wealthy person who's very patiently and cutting and everything with patience doesn't seem to be running after. So that's what you would assume. But the truth is, it's the other way around. The truth is, it's the rich person who's accustomed to this and needs it more. How do you know? Take away the food. Take it away. If you take the food right in front of them and take it all away, now the poor person says, okay, fine, I didn't have food yesterday. Now I thought I had it, now I don't have it either. Try taking away the plate of food from the wealthy person who's expecting it. They get angry. What do you mean? This is my food, I need it. So even though what you may think is that someone who doesn't have something, the initial thought, someone who doesn't have something is one who really needs it. Often it's the other way around. The person who has a lot of it is the one who really needs it and is really connected to it on a much deeper level. This is all connected to this point. The point is, this whole thing is a side note in the Talmud, just explaining a verse, but it's a very profound lesson, which I think we can all relate to. Anyway, so that's what the Gemara says. He says, David HaMelech thought that was his mistake. Fine. The next, going back to that verse, which leads to this unique story. Vayishalech el gag beis hamelech. And he now goes to the rooftop of the palace, or the house of the king. What happens here? Vayar isha rochetzes me'al hagad. He sees a woman bathing there. Va'isha tovas ma'ot, a very beautiful woman, Batsheva. And this is Batsheva. This is the Batsheva, famous David and Batsheva. Havakachai parisha to sechalsa, and she was washing her hair, but she was washing her hair under I mean, it seems to be strange that someone would be bathing, especially if she was a righteous woman. She's the mother of King Solomon. So that she should be bathing in the open seems to be unusual. So the Talmud says, no, it wasn't in the open. She was washing her hair to say chalsa. She was under an awning of some sort, to say chalsa. It was not. She was not out in the open, right? A large cone, there's a translation here. Large cone hid her from view. So the truth is, you wouldn't be able to see her. Asa Satan, remember, David HaMelech asked for a test. So the Satan came. People ask if Judaism believes in Satan. Some people think Satan is not a Jewish idea; it's a Christian idea. Judaism believes in Satan, but not the Satan that the Christians believe in. Because we're the ones who know Satan is not a inherently evil entity. Satan is God's angel designated to test us in negative ways. Anyway, so the Satan came, Ivnile Kitsi Parta, and seemed to David HaMelech like a bird. Somehow pretending to be a bird. Pasak Bei Gira, and what happens is the David HaMelech sees this bird, and he shoots an arrow at the bird. The arrow misses the bird. Paska Lechalsa, instead it hits that awning which was covering her. Igle, now we have all the back over here. Suddenly that awning is open, the chazye, and that's how he sees it. So we're talking about a situation where she didn't intend to do anything wrong. He didn't intend to do anything wrong. As we said earlier, David asked to be tested. This is how he was tested. And as soon as he saw her, miyad, immediately he was struck by her beauty. And by Yishlach, as the pasuk then continues, again, this is Shmuel Beis, Perek Yidal, pasuk Gimel and Dalet. By Yishlach, David sent messengers. By Yidrosh Isha to find out who this woman was. By Yomer, and he was told, Halo Zos, this is Batsheva, Bas Eliam, the daughter of Eliam, Eshes, the wife of Uriah Hachiti, the wife of Uriah Hachiti. That's what he was told. Vayishlach David Malachim, David sent messengers, Vayikacheha, and he had her brought to him, Vatave Elam, and she came to him, Vayishkavima, and they were intimate with one another, Vihi Miskadeshan, Vitumasa, and she was purified from her impurity. And then she returns to her house. This is the story. So David HaMelech clearly he asked for a test. God told him what I'm going to test you about, and by all indications, he didn't pass the test. Now it's important to separate between the words he didn't pass the test versus whether he sinned, because even though this seems to be a very open sin, right? He was told this is Batsheva, the wife of Uriah Hachiti. Doesn't say that he sinned. In fact, we're going to point out elsewhere the Talmud says David HaMelech did not actually technically sin. He did not commit a sin. We'll explain why in a moment.
Oh, yeah, but I don't understand from the beginning. David HaMelech asked Hashem why he's not on the Shmona Esrei.
Okay.
It wasn't Shmona Esrei when David HaMelech was alive.
It wasn't established. Firstly, okay, the Shmona Esrei was something which was established later by Anshe Knesset Adon.
Right. Nobody said
Okay.
Shmona Esrei.
So one way of understanding it, perhaps, is that David HaMelech had divine prophecy of what would happen. David HaMelech looked ahead of time and said that he sees that. Possibly, I mean, if you look in the Mefarshim on this, possibly it could be also understood that that even then there was this tradition to pray in such a way that people would daven, even though it wasn't an organized davening. Davening existed; it was just not as organized. The organized davening happened after Anshe Knesset Adon. So perhaps even then the minhag was, and then the Anshe Knesset Adon, when they established something, it was based on a tradition. You know, where do we know? In other words, where do we know that we mention Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? In the Chumash it says so. In Parshas Lech Lecha, we have Abraham says to when the first bracha that Hashem gives to Abraham, right? Lech Lecha mi'artzecha. Hashem says that so there Rashi already says that Hashem was promising him that when people bench you, they're gonna mention Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But we're going to conclude with you. So already we have a tradition going back then. So perhaps even then people daven, even if it wasn't organized in the prayer book, but even then people daven in such a way. So maybe that, or maybe David HaMelech had Ruach HaKodesh of how it would be. I'm not sure. Those are the two thoughts that come to mind about that. Anyway, so David HaMelech takes this Batsheva and they are intimate with one another, then she returns home. Now, the Gemara is not going to get to the rest of the story about how this story developed and what happened afterwards. David HaMelech found out that Uriah was in the battle and he had him sent to the front lines. And Uriah died in battle, and then Batsheva then marries David completely. But either way, this is the story as the Gemara is talking about.
I have a question.
Yes.
So if the answer was that it would be divine prophecy, then he can't change the future, can he? He changes the outcome of the future. Like if he has Ruach HaKodesh and he sees the future, can he change the outcome?
Maybe you could change it. Maybe, but that's not the point of here. He's asking why. Does he want to know? And God answered that question. Maybe, But his question was why? Why is it Schusavos and not my Schus? Why am I not included in that exclusive club?
I would think of it as private, like he's not son or he's not a father of father.
So that's a little bit, again, I don't want to go too on a tangent, but Noach is a father of all the Jewish people too. Right? And I'm a Kohen, so I know that I descend from Aaron. So it's not just that, and furthermore, to add to this, a convert does not descend from Abraham. So clearly there's more to it simply than the biological descendancy of these people. There's something more to it. Although that is a technically good answer. Again, all this is I got it, but the point is that he felt that I should be included, that I could, his righteousness was enough to be included. Anyway, so back to the Gemara. Behind the Dichsiv, this is the meaning of the pasuk. If you have the Tehillim now, you can open up again to Psalm 17, verse number 3. And over here, what does it say? This is the meaning of the verse, which states, Bachanta libi pakadata laila saraftani bal timsa. You see that, Jacob? Chapter
Yeah.
17, verse 3. Can you translate
You
that?
examined my heart, you searched at night, you tested me.
And
You found not.
you found not to be pure. So now suddenly that pasuk makes a lot more sense. You examined my heart, you searched me, searched by night. Remember, this episode happened by night. He rose at nighttime. But Sraftani refined me. In other words, that is another form of refining, but did not find me to be pure. That's the meaning of that pasuk. He says you searched, and indeed, I didn't pass. And Zamosi, then goes the end of that verse is Zamosi Bal Yavor Bi. Amar David HaMelech said, Iku Zimama Nofa Bekume Deman Desani Li. Yeah, he says, V'lo Amar Kiyom Nosa. Would that a muzzle have fallen upon my mouth, the mouth of my enemy, that he had not said such a thing as a request to be tested. From here, we see that David HaMelech saying, concluding that I should not have asked to be tested. In life, we shouldn't ask to be tested. Now, I want to bring a footnote over here, if you have the article in front of you, because I want to bring up, we mentioned earlier, that even though David HaMelech did not pass the test, it doesn't necessarily mean that he sinned. How can he not sin? After all, here you have a woman, a married woman, and the king has the woman brought to him, and they're intimate with one another. That seems to be the ultimate act of adultery. So then how can we say that David HaMelech did not sin? So let me quote from over here. The Gemara elsewhere says, Gemara Shabbos, that Kol HaOmer David Chata Eino Lato. Whoever says David HaMelech sinned is making a mistake. How could it be they're making a mistake? So here you have some interesting, there's several answers given to explain how David HaMelech didn't actually sin. The Gemara explains that it was customary in David HaMelech's time for soldiers going out to battle to give their wives conditional bills of divorce. You can give a person can give a divorce on condition. In general, there's something called a t'nai. T'nai means condition, and you could marry someone on condition, and you can divorce someone on condition. You can marry someone on condition that if I buy this house, then we are Hariyat Nikudeshesli, you are betrothed to me on condition that I buy this house. So now, and obviously the woman has to agree. But then it's up to me. If I go and buy that house, now I'm married to her. If I don't buy the house, I'm not. So you can do things like this. You can divorce on condition as well.
You learn that pure or that love can't be based on something.
Oh, right. The love should not be based on any, but there's a difference between, right, Ava she'ena tluya v'dav, love that's not based on anything. And by the way, who's the example of love that's not based on anything? David and Melech. Back to the same person. But David and Jonas, not with his wife, David with Jonas. But it's different based on something versus on condition of something. But you're right. It's probably not a good idea when you propose. Will you marry me on condition that I eat this hamburger or something?
But it's Kenyan, it's not the law in this.
Right. So kiddushin is a form of acquisition. But gerushin,
buy.
the point is that the soldiers going out to war. It's a fascinating thing that happened. One of the great halachic problems that can exist, and unfortunately does exist, is a topic called is something called an aguna. Heard of an aguna? Aguna means a chained woman. There's different examples of aguna. Unfortunately, there's tragic examples of, but on a basic level, aguna means someone who they don't know what happened to their husband. In order for a woman to remarry, she either has to be divorced or widowed. But if, let's say, a husband goes missing, and again, today, thank God, you don't have it as common, because today there's so many forms of connection of even if you're across the world, you make a phone call. But throughout history, the concept of aguna was very prevalent. Someone went out, a business person went out to sea, and they never showed up and never came back. Now, this woman, unless she knows that her husband died, may be a married woman. So that's a big halachic issue. Throughout all of history, we have a halachic response about the problem of aguna. So one of the things that happened in history, by the way, aguna questions still come up. As recently as something like the tragedy that took place 2 months ago in Florida. A building collapses. The fact that we can assume that someone in there, if there's a husband, and there were several husbands there whose wives weren't there, Jewish husbands. The fact that we can just assume that they were there is not enough to free their wives to allow to remarry. You have to know, you have to find DNA evidence. What constitutes DNA evidence? So the issue of aguna is a real question. So here you have, in ancient times, the soldiers, before they went to war, they would write a bill of divorce on condition. They would divorce their wives and say, I am divorcing you on condition that if I don't return from war, you are now divorced. That was, if the soldier does not return home from war, to add to the complication of this, they are retroactively divorced from the moment the divorce was given. It's not as if we say, well, they don't come back, so now they're not. No, it goes, now we look backward and we say, the moment that he gave it and she accepted the bill of divorce is when the divorce kicked in, retroactive. So that's what would happen. So now this story happens while Uriah is out in war. So David HaMelech, when he summoned this woman, she was in the possible stage of divorce, and ultimately her husband did not return from war. So therefore, retroactively, she was a divorced woman. So she was not a married woman. So it's not an act of adultery.
Well, couldn't it still be an issue because they're not married? Because not married, right?
So that's a much lesser. Firstly, there's a form of kiddushin. There is a form of betrothal through intimacy, although it's not appropriate, but it is. But certainly, that's a lesser issue than adultery. That's not form of adultery. Is very specific. Adultery is a man with a married woman.
Well, not necessarily adultery, but like being intimate.
Right. Right, but the sin which we usually associate when we think of David and Batsheva is that was a married woman. That's how it's typically understood. That's what the Gemara is coming to say. So this was done. So in other words, this process where a soldier would divorce his wife, get Christmas close to this is done to avoid various tragedies, including that of aguna. At the time of this incident, the Jews were at war with the nation of Ammon, and Bathsheba's husband Uriah was away at battle. Thus, she had received a conditional divorce. Ultimately, Uriah did die in battle, and the divorce took effect retroactively. Thus, Bathsheba was unwed when David took her. And furthermore, it says she was in a state of purity. The reason David was chastised, the reason why he was rebuked for this act is that he should have refrained nonetheless. So therefore, it's important to understand the story the way we understand it in the Talmud, is that he did fail the test, but he didn't commit the sin of adultery. And that's how we are to view the story from the Talmudic perspective. Now, I want to maybe share a few more in connection to the story. I'm going to go ahead a little bit to Omar Darash Rav. Rava says like this. My dechsiv. What is again? Let's go back to the Tehillim. You'd like Omar Rava. What is the meaning of the pasuk? Lam Natseach, verse number Tehillim again. If you want to follow Tehillim, Psalm 11, verse number 1. Lam Natseach leDavid b'cha Hashem Hashem chasisi. Eich tomru lenafshi nudi harchem tzipor. For the conductor by David HaMelech, in God I have taken refuge. B'cha Hashem chasisi. And how can you say your mountain was moved by a bird? Your mountain was moved by a bird. Nudi harchem tzipor. Your mountain was moved by a bird. Now you read this before we read this Gemara. What in the world is that? How's a mountain moved by a bird? But remember, this story, we found a connection to a bird. It was a bird that was what led David HaMelech to sin. Amar David HaMelech, the deeper meaning behind this pasuk is that David HaMelech says, Rebbeinu Shalom. This is why I thought of this Gemara for today, because we are now in the month of El, the month of Tshuva. So we have many great people in our history. We have many of the greats, Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, but the one, our greatest leader, who is referred to as a Baal Tshuva, is David HaMelech. David HaMelech is known as the quintessential Baal Tshuva, the one who committed a sin, even though again, not really a sin, the one who made a mistake. I think we can differentiate between a mistake and a sin, and nevertheless showed us the process of Tshuva. So the way David, perhaps as much as we could look at the story as just an exciting story to share, and but the truth is, the deeper reason of the story is just to teach us the power of Tshuva and how David, the king, the humility he had in his process of Tshuva. So we see that he suffered for years. He suffered for years because of this mistake. Yeah.
Can't we say because Natan, we came to him and he did all Kivsat Arash, the sheep, that even though it's not a formal sin or formal mitzvah in the Torah, can we follow the Asita Yashar V'Atov? It doesn't look good.
So listen, David HaMelech himself, what was his response? Just to clarify what Matan is talking about. The David HaMelech afterwards is visited by Natan HaNavi. Where does he get into it? And Natan the Navi rebukes him. He gives him a whole parable of a person who had many sheep, and then there was another person who had one sheep. And and yet the one with many sheep took that person's sheep. And he says to David HaMelech, what should happen to that person? David HaMelech gets angry and he says, that person should be killed, a horrible thing. And he told David, basically that's what you did. You have many wives, you have everything. And here you have this one person, Uriah, who only has his wife, and you took that away from him. So that was his way of rebuking the king. He basically, very, very wise. In other words, he caused the king to rebuke himself. Brilliant process. Instead of trying to tell him you did something wrong, paint a different scenario and let the person diagnose it themselves. So therefore, David HaMelech diagnosed his own actions. And and Uriah says that's exactly what the example, the parable I just gave you is what you did. What's David HaMelech's response? He says, I have sinned. Because he acknowledged it himself. So David HaMelech said, I have sinned. But the Gemara says, so David HaMelech said, I have sinned. He means to say that I didn't pass this test. But as far as to assume that David HaMelech committed an act of adultery, again, there's just various levels. Adultery is one of the three major sins. To say that David HaMelech sinned that way is different than saying that he didn't pass this test. David HaMelech himself acknowledged he made a mistake. But the Gemara, not elsewhere, wants to emphasize that he didn't. But even after he says and admitted, Chatasi, I have sinned, he spends next many years doing tshuva. And here's what he says. So David HaMelech says, Macholi Eloi Siyavan, forgive me for this sin. Shelo Yomru, says David HaMelech to God, forgive me that they shouldn't say, Harsha Bachem Sipor Nedalito, that this mountain, which is David HaMelech, was led astray by a tzipor, by a bird. That this bird got in the way, which caused him to shoot the arrow. And that is what is gotten. So I want to share again from the bottom over here in the article is a fascinating explanation over here from the Maharal. Maharal, who is it's a combination of philosophy and mysticism. He says like this. He says, what is this whole idea of a bird, that Batsheva is under an awning and a bird came like this? This seems to share something more profound. It seems to be a strange. He says, Maharal explains the reference to shooting at the bird as an allusion to a diversion from the pursuit of Torah study to the indulgence in leisure. He says there's a deeper idea over here. Initially, David HaMelech was someone who just studied Torah. So David HaMelech's uninterrupted devotion to Torah served as a barrier between him and temptation. That awning which separated Batsheva from David, says Maharal, it's not, you can take it literally, but a deeper meaning is that when you study Torah, you're creating a barrier between yourself and temptation. Torah becomes that barrier because life is filled with temptation. How do we overcome temptation? You could spend all your life just fighting it. I'm not going to give in, or you could create a protective, you can put on sunglasses, you can put on shades. Who's the president who said that before you're married, you should have your eyes wide open, and afterwards, messing it up. One of our presidents or something, one of the old, says when you marry, you have your eyes half shut or something. But the point is that you create barriers. What is the idea? When a person studies Torah, that becomes the barrier between them and temptation. Hence, Batsheva was hidden from his view by a cone. In other words, what that means is that even her exceedingly beautiful appearance did not attract him. However, Satan's method is to ensnare a person gradually, diverting him with seemingly innocuous acts which ultimately lead to sin. Satan thus appeared as a bird, diverting Torah from his Torah study to a moment of leisure, shooting at the bird. In that moment, David's barrier to temptation was broken. So there's a deeper understanding. Is that Satan understands that the idea is you're not going to just tempt someone, as long as someone's involved in Torah activity, in prayer, in mitzvahs, then there's a protective shield. So Satan doesn't tell someone who's in the middle of of studying Torah, you should be tempted by such a thing. No, that's not going to work. The first step is to divert them from Torah, divert them from their spiritual pursuits, to pursue leisure. Nothing wrong with leisure. Leisure is not simple. As soon as a person is involved in leisurely activity, now suddenly the barrier is no longer there. Now someone has an opportunity to tempt them. I think this is important, especially when we're at the end of summer. So that's so kind of. But at the beginning of summer, we leave school. When we go on vacation, it's important to realize vacation is okay, but you have to be extra careful. Just like David HaMelech, as long as you're studying, as long as you're involved in holy or proper pursuits, then you have a protective shield. As soon as we leave into actions of leisure, again, leisure is not simple, but as soon as we go into leisure, we're removing that shield, and suddenly that which we weren't necessarily tempted by before is more likely to tempt.
That's not necessarily the morality. I mean, that's the result of it.
That's what the Maharal is explaining the story to be sharing that idea, that a person doesn't typically go from spiritual activity to falling to temptation. Usually there is something in between, and that something in between is what he's understanding the meaning. The David shot at the bird. In other words, he went from Torah to hunting. Hunting is whatever. We're not having this discussion whether hunting is permitted or not. But the point is that it was just leisure. He went from the Satan knew that as long as David is involved in Torah and prayer, there's no hope. When he moves into the field of leisure, now the shield is gone. Again, that's the deeper understanding of this idea of the arrow and the shield. The shield was gone. His shield of protection of Torah and prayer was no longer there. So again, I'm not suggesting, I don't think it's realistic to say we should always be involved in Torah and prayer, but recognize that when you go into the field of leisure, that's where you have to be extra careful to avoid those areas which we can be seduced by. And finally, one last line from the Gemara, and then we'll conclude. Another Darash about this story. What is the meaning of the pasuk? And again, if you have the Tehillim, you could look it up. Psalm 51, verse number 6. 51, verse number 6. David HaMelech says, "L'cha levadcha chatas." To you alone I have sinned. V'hara be'einecha asisi, and I did wrong in your eyes. L'man titztak b'davrecha tizke b'shavtecha, so that you would be justified and correct when you judge. What's the meaning of that? That I sinned to you alone, so that you would be justified. It says, Rabbi gives a very interesting thing. He says an explanation here. He says, Amar David lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. David said to God, Galia v'yedia kama. It is known to you and revealed to you. That the truth is, I would typically have overcome my Yetzer Hara, my temptation for this. And why didn't? I sinned, the sin happened so that it shouldn't be said that the servant bested the master. So there's different ways of understanding. David HaMelech says, really, I would have passed this test. This is a test that I typically would pass. So I want to share the Maharal's explanation of this. Again, Rashi says, Maharal says like this, that the truth is, David HaMelech understood that this was a test that he would typically pass. And why didn't he pass this test? Because he brought it on himself. No, this goes back to our first point. That David HaMelech said, "L'chal avach l'chatasi." I sin to you. Notice, this is not a sin that I should have really failed in. This is a sin that I, previously I would have passed this. The only reason I didn't pass it is because I initiated. Because I asked you to be tested, and therefore you tested me, so therefore that brought out a weakness. Had I not asked, had this come about as a test without me asking it, I would have passed this test. So because I challenged you, God, and I said, God, test me the way you tested Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So that's why I failed this test. That's the meaning behind that passage. I sinned to you, so that you would be proven to be correct. In other words, you basically told me you're not going to pass this test. And because I asked you to be tested, and you said that that I won't pass it, that's the only reason I didn't pass it. But otherwise, inherently, I really am strong enough to pass this. But I brought about this problem by initiating. Anyways, this is the Gemara. Maybe next week we'll continue as David HaMelech's response and how he did tshuva for this. So most of this discussion was about the sin that he did. Next week we'll learn more so about how he did tshuva and how the pain he endured because of this sin, really for most of the rest of his life, and what the lessons that opened. But again, just to recap, I think some of the very important lessons we learned today. One is, it's okay when you're tested, but don't put yourself in a situation of being tested. Don't look for a challenge in life. If it comes, then it's an opportunity to express inner strength. Don't look for it. We pointed out the lesson of David HaMelech that his mistake about when it comes to indulgence, don't assume that if you indulge enough, then you're not going to be interested anymore. That's not usually the way it is. And then there's the humility of such a mistake that David HaMelech had, immediately acknowledging the mistake and immediately asking for repentance. But as we pointed out, it was a mistake, but it's not the adultery which is typically associated. Certainly in secular sources, the way the story is painted is that David committed an act of adultery. The Jewish sources do not support that. We understand it as a not passing of a test, but not an act of adultery. All right. Next week. Thank you all for joining us. Now, I have to be honest. The challah today was cooked for a couple hours less than it typically does. So I'm hoping